Good afternoon. 2 o'clock. I hit the button. We're good to go. Before I get started, I want to thank, and I think you should also thank the sponsors for Drupal GovCon. Great. Make sure you thank the volunteers that are walking around in red shirts. Don't be shy to go up and give them a hug. There's a lot of work that goes into these conferences, and it's a great 3 days, as you know, so make sure you thank them. And I'm also very grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you guys today about a topic that I'm quite passionate about. So a show of hands to start. How many people here are using Windows as their primary computer? We'll call it your daily driver. So maybe half the room. I would expect that in a Gov conference. How about Macs? About 50-50. And any Linux? Holy cow. I got one of these up here. We'll find out what that means later. I did a presentation, not this one, back last month at Design for Drupal in Boston. And I asked the same question to about 40 people. And I had 2 PCs and 1 Linux computer out of the 40 people. So the PCs are represented today, which is great. So I'm talking today about switching to Linux. And this is the second time in my life that I've made one of these big switches for the operating system. Back about 15 years ago, I bought a Mac Mini, sat it next to me in my office, plugged a monitor and a keyboard into it, and figured I'm going to figure out what this Mac thing is. I had never used one. About 60 days later, that Mac Mini was now sitting in front of me, and my giant gateway computer had moved to the right-hand side. And about 6 months after that, I was remote desktoping into the Windows computer when I needed it, and never turned that monitor on again. So I went through the same transition, one very similar to it, in the last year and a half, and that's what this talk is about. And I am Stephencross. I have a podcast, Talking Drupal, if you're ever interested in listening to 3 guys chat every week about Drupal-y kind of things. You can visit talkingdrupal.com. I also am an organizer of the New England Drupal Camp, which will be in November this year. So if you're interested in getting some cool weather and seeing some fall foliage in the Boston area or the New England area, check that out as well. And the third point on there is a lie. These slides are not up at stephencross.com/presentations yet. They will be later today, but they are available right now on Drupal GovCon on my slide page. So, I was married to my first wife in 1990. That's a joke. She doesn't like that joke very often. Technically, she is my first wife. And for those of you who are doing the math, it's 29 years we've been married, which is not bad, but you know what? It's not all smooth sailing. Everyone knows that any relationship, marriage or not, that goes on 29 years has its ups and downs. And unfortunately, about 15 years ago, there was a bump in my marriage, and it was a new love affair. And like any love affair, it often starts with a curiosity. You're curious about something and you look into it a little bit. I got curious, and that love affair came so unexpectedly. He was so charming and so smart. He had this vision, and his life was all about that vision, and he shared it like no one else in history ever had. I did not miss a word of that man from any keynote or interview he did until the time he died. And he was a big reason why I fell in love with the Apple product and the Apple brand. That was my first Apple product in 2004. That is the very one. It was a gift from my first wife for Father's Day. And at that point in time, there were a lot of MP3 players out. they were a hot topic. They were a hot product. There was Napster, downloading MP3 files for music. All that legal way to get music back then. And this device was like nothing else on the market for this kind of listening to music and downloading music. The software that went with it worked easy. It was easy to use. It was my introduction into Apple. And as I mentioned earlier, I bought a Mac Mini. That was about a year later. And from that point on, it has been, just like I said, a love affair with Apple computers. This is the earliest photo I could find of me with a computer, or an Apple computer. That was in 2007. And that was kind of before iPhones. We weren't taking pictures and have a camera in our pocket 24 hours a day. What's really sad though, as I started to look through the photos, trying to find me and computers, basically my digital footprint, when people look at it 50 years from now, will be me taking pictures of my computers and my cats. That's what people know about stephencross moving forward. And you'll notice on the table there, right in front of the computer, is a device. Anyone know what that is? BlackBerry. It's a BlackBerry, yeah. So I'm an early adopter of technology, always have been. I went from Palm Pilot to Trios to the iPhone. And it's a dangerous thing as a tech person. The people in the Clark crowd that know me know that I kind of get excited about something and then I kind of dig into it and learn it and understand it and then probably drop it pretty quickly and move forward. I do that a lot. In fact, over the past month I've been obsessed with static site generation from Drupal. There's some modules that do it and I've been playing with it and learning it. And then that Brian Olendike yesterday, I went to his training and now he's got me excited about web components. So I can see over the next month, now I'm going to be dropping the static website stuff and chasing the web components. But it's my nature. But I usually drop stuff after I learn it. I understand I drop it. I never did that with the Mac. It was an experiment I tried, but I stuck with it. I went from iMac to iMac. I went to each generation of the iPads. I went from 13-inch, 15-inch, 17-inch MacBooks over a period of time. Each of the devices got handed down through the family. So we were an Apple family. So my daughters grew up middle school, high school, college, all having Macs. And I was the guy who even went on these little journeys and visited in any city I was in. I went to visit the Apple store. I was the guy waiting in line when the new operating system came out that you had to pay for. I mean, it was crazy. But it wasn't just me. I brought up a family as Apple lovers. The whole family loved the Apple computers, especially my cats, as you can see. So there is my digital footprint. But about a year and a half, 2 years ago, love went on the rocks somehow. I still use Apple products. I still love them. Have an iPhone, have a watch, have an iPad, have lots of things that are Apple. But I actually believe there's better solutions now for people like, I'll say us, people who are devs, full stack developers, maybe not everyone, but there is a better solution today, and that's the solution that I'm going to talk about. So why did I start to switch? So there are really two reasons for me. There's this philosophical reason about liking open source and free software and privacy, and all those are all valid things. Those aren't the reasons why I started to look at Linux, and they are part of the reason that I like being where I am now, and I'm not going to talk about those things today. I'm going to talk about the other things. So for me, the first thing was I wasn't happy with Apple's direction. As much as I liked them as a company, I think I was mesmerized by the brand and not necessarily by what they were giving us. And the second thing is my professional development. I think that was real important to me and was an important reason why I switched. So let's talk a little bit more about the Apple thing. This is a quote from Phil Schiller, who's the Vice President of Marketing of Apple. 2012, in one of the keynote presentations, he says, it's the most beautiful computer we've ever made. He was referring at the time to the new MacBook Pro that was announced that year. And frankly, it probably was. They are beautiful computers. The hardware works great. The software works great. But he did say it's the most beautiful computer we've ever made. And then if you've watched these kind of keynotes in the past, you hear him say things like, this is the lightest computer we've ever made. This is the most elegant computer we've ever made. You don't often hear him say, this is the most functional computer that you can use that's the most flexible for you. They do make excellent hardware, and they do make excellent software. But I feel like that started to change around 2016. In 2016, they released the 4th gen MacBook Pro, and this is one example for Apple. And I kind of focus mostly on the laptops, which is where I've spent most of my hard-earned money over the years. In 2016, we started to see the MacBook change. So how is it changing? Well, the ports were disappearing. We didn't have display ports anymore. We didn't have USB ports anymore. That release of the MacBook Pro, also there were lots of keyboard issues that were coming out. People were having problems with the keyboards. And an indication that something was wrong at the time was the popularity of the 2015 MacBook Pro. People who are Mac evangelists say that that was probably the best laptop they ever made. And proof of that is that they were still selling the 2015 MacBook Pro. You couldn't see it in an Apple store, but you could buy it online from them until about a year ago. So 2 years after the 4th generation MacBook came out, they were still selling the previous generation because developers wanted them. They wanted those ports back. My favorite MacBook Pro was the 2011. That's going pretty far back. I love the form factor of in 2013. What I liked about it the most, and the reason why I still have 2 of them that operate in my house, is because you could upgrade them. You could switch the hard drive to an SSD, which I did for both of them. You could upgrade the memory from 4 gigabytes up to 16 if you went to the right third-party market. You could replace the battery on your own. There's things you could do on your own and do them easily. So these 2 computers are still in my house and still functioning today. They're not running Mac OS anymore. And it's not because I don't want them to, it's because Mac doesn't allow me to. So Mac came out with Mojave last year, and their minimum requirements are a MacBook Pro mid-2012 or newer. That's what they're required to install the latest version of their operating system. So anybody with anything older than that, you're stuck. So what's going to happen is when they end of life, that operating system that they allow you to run on older machines, they're really ending the life of that hardware as well. Why do they do that? Well, I can't explain why they do that. I could come up with reasons like they want to sell me new hardware, because you can actually go online and find ways to install Mojave on older computers. The people who have done it are reporting that the computer runs better on the newer versions of the software. So it is possible. It's just not supported by Apple. So in my humble opinion, I believe the company, in terms of the hardware that I'm interested in, has chose beauty over function. That the consumer is their priority and not the professional, and you have less choice. You can't upgrade. It's really, they've kind of moved into this disposable computer model where you buy something from them and in 3 years you need to replace it. Not because it doesn't work anymore, but because it's starting to get slow and they're not going to support it and those kinds of things. Now I sound like a guy who hates Apple, but I don't. That was reason number 1 that I decided to look at Linux. Number 2 was this, my professional development. So coming from this is a Drupal conference, we'll come at this from a Drupal dev perspective. So Drupal developers generally have a skill set that looks like they have PHP, you need to be able to do some JavaScript, you need to do some twig work, you need to know some CSS, and having some design skill at some level is always good. Now, depending on your level of skills in those areas, you might be a Drupal developer who's a front-end person mostly because you're strong in Twig, strong in CSS. You might be more of a back-end person, which is generally where I am. I'm stronger in PHP and JavaScript and things like that. But with the advent over the last 4 or 5 years of modern workflows for us, where we got local dev environments, we have front-end builds and continuous integration and deployment and lots of automation, it really almost has become a requirement that every Drupal developer has some DevOps skills. Everyone needs those skills to survive, regardless if you're a front-end guy or a back-end guy. There's a lot of automation, a lot of scripting that makes our websites happen. And if you start to think about Drupal in Linux, our production websites, in general, anyone running production on Windows? Any production sites on Windows? No, okay. Just checking. I know there are people that do it.
I feel like we should have taken a video of that.
So our production servers are running in Linux. And in today's world, when we're using these local dev tools like Lando and DDev, they're Docker-based tools. Docker runs on Linux. It's a Linux product. When you run it on Mac, Mac is kicking off a Linux kernel so it can run Docker on it. So I started to think to myself, this was my thought process. Stephen, yes? If I actually work more in Linux, I'll be closer to my deployment environment if I work day to day in it. I'll get more comfortable in that technology. And I'll learn more DevOps stuff. So moving to Linux for me was as much as a professional development step that I took than anything else. And in the end, I'd be more valuable to my team. So if you look around at the team of people you're working with on your dev team, how many people are sitting on a Linux computer every day? By the statistics here, probably none, or maybe one. But if you have someone on your team that's doing that, they're getting more comfortable in that deployment environment. They're getting more comfortable in an environment where we all really would work better and where we're better off as Drupal developers. So I think if you went to the team that I work with and say, hey, what are some of the values Stephen has brought to the team? I think one of those things has been DevOps. 4 years ago, I was not comfortable jumping on a production server, getting to a command line and knowing the commands and getting around. I'd do it if I had to, but I wasn't comfortable. I'm not like that today. Might be a little dangerous. Maybe I should be a little bit more cautious, but I'm now really comfortable in that environment. The reason is because I'm in it every day. So as we move forward here, what is Linux? I'm not going to go into a big long explanation. I want to point out a few things about what Linux is that makes it valuable to us and why you should switch. So if you think about the proprietary operating systems, I'm pointing out 3 here, Windows, Mac OS, and Chrome OS. And Chrome OS, by the way, is proprietary. It's Chromium that isn't. That's the open source product. These operating systems are developed and controlled by one company. And basically, they create a single version of an operating system that runs on one piece of hardware. The complete opposite of that is Linux. It's open source. It's developed by hundreds of companies, profit and nonprofit. And there's contributors, thousands of contributors and individuals that contribute to this operating system. Anyone can modify it. If someone wants a version of Linux that is designed to be super fast, they can create it if it doesn't exist. If someone wants a version of Linux that works on a computer for someone who's doing audio and visual work, someone can create that. If someone wants to run Linux on a computer that wants current hardware and they want the most current drivers that are available for things, you can download a version of Linux for that. The options are limitless, and there's no one that stops you from doing anything. There's not one company controlling the direction of that operating system. So, if you need something done, there's a version of Linux for that. These are called distributions. So let's not get too crazy on the technical side here, but this is a very high level of what the Drupal, what the Linux stack looks like. So I don't know if this little light is going to work up there, but at the bottom we have hardware. So that's your computer that you're using. The piece of software that talks to your hardware is called the Linux kernel. That's the piece, that's the layer that interfaces between the software running in Linux and your hardware. On top of the Linux kernel is these distributions, and these are the things that you've heard about Linux. You've heard of probably Debian, Ubuntu, Fedora, Linux Mint, OpenSUSE, Arch, the list goes on and on. There are hundreds of them, thousands of them. So all these distributions get created on top of this Linux kernel, and what is really a distribution? It's a configuration of software and configuration bundled together to make Linux work in a certain way. On top of that distribution, and also kind of part of it, are these things called desktop environments. You hear them called DEs. I don't know if you've ever heard of these things, but there's KDE, GNOME, Mate, Budgie. This is the graphical interface that you get access to when you're running Linux. So when you're choosing Linux, you're choosing this distribution, and then you have choices of the desktop environments that run within those distributions. So you have lots of choices. If you go online and you want to learn a little bit more about distributions, you'll see these hysterical maps. This is a real tame one that show you the relationships between the Linux kernel and all these distributions. Back on this list, one thing I wanted to point out is Debian is a distribution that Ubuntu is built on top of, and then Linux Mint is built upon Ubuntu. So you get these stacks of these distributions that are built upon each other, and they create these different flavors. This is a diagram of some of those relationships. So I want to talk a little bit about flexibility that you get from this Linux environment. Am I doing a good job of selling so far? Yeah. Okay, all right, good. Just checking. And one thing that's happened great for us devs in the Drupal world is these advent of Docker in this containerized environment. It's been super great because now we're not running like PHP and Apache on our local machines anymore. We're running in these containers or these virtual machines, and what that's done for us, it's allowed us to create a single environment for like a website that can run in Windows, it can run on a Mac, and the developers all get the same thing. It works the same way exactly everywhere. It's very flexible. So developers have flexibility on the machines they can work on, and then when they move from project to project, if they're in the same containerized way, it all works the same way. Lots of flexibility and ease for us. A lot of DevOps work, by the way, to make that happen. But it's really been great for developers. The Mac, on the left-hand side, we get the Mac operating system, which only runs on Apple hardware. It's the only place it goes. If you want to run Mac OS on Mac applications, there's only one choice in that hardware. On the right-hand side, Windows is a lot more flexible. You got Windows as an operating system, and you have lots of hardware that you can run on. But it's still controlled by one company. Windows is controlling, and Microsoft is controlling what hardware it can run on, the drivers that are available, and they make the decisions about how old they're going to support things and that kind of stuff. So you don't have a lot of say there. In terms of flexibility, this is the way it looks in Linux. You've got that Linux kernel that's talking to the talking to the hardware, and you get those distribution layers on top, and the hardware can be lots of stuff underneath. You're looking at Internet of Things devices running Linux. You've got laptops, desktops. You've got single board computers, mainframe computers, old hardware, new hardware, all running from the same kernel that's up to date. So I can run a 10-year-old computer on the same software that's running on my brand new laptop, and it's kept up with security and privacy and all those good things. Nothing was left behind. And if something gets left behind, there's thousands of people that are going to fix it. So if you think of that layer, let's go back to this layer here 1 second. The slide right there. This happens every day, every week in Linux. Someone finds a bug, or there's a new hardware that comes out, there's a new drive, and there needs to be a new driver. Someone ships a new video card, say. Someone gets a video card, doesn't run in Linux. All these distributions out there are working to solve this problem. One person solves this problem, whatever it is, a bug or a piece of hardware, it gets shared among the distributions, goes up and down those chains of relationships, and ends up at the kernel at some point. So you got lots of people trying to solve very similar problems. So all that means to you is you have choice. So if you want to have a beefy desktop computer with 4 displays in your office, go pick out the hardware that you want, find the best deal, put it in your office. If you want a lightweight, minimal port laptop for traveling, like a MacBook Air, you can have that. If you would like a laptop that's a little different, you don't care how light it is, you'd rather make sure it has lots of ports and SD cards for you, you can have that. No one else is making that choice for you, it's your choice. Or you want to put a little small profile computer in the family room for the kids to play on, you can get that. So you've separated the hardware choice from the operating system. So, how did I switch? This is how I switched. And this started about 1.5 years, 2 years ago. I started to educate myself. And this is where I think you should start if you're considering switching. And the way I educate myself today on all these things that I get interested in, whether it be for 2 days or 2 months, I go to YouTube, I do some searching there, find the people who are passionate about that topic, and just start subscribing and watching all their content. I also go to podcasts, find some podcasts that are out there, start to listen to all that stuff. In a few weeks, you start to learn all the Linux terms. You start to learn what the different distributions are. So I educated myself in that way. One of the things I learned that was very important from a lot of people who were giving advice in these places about how to start with Linux is here some people say, oh, just take your old laptop out of the closet, install Linux on it. You know, the computer you haven't used in 10 years, you don't know what shape it's in, that will be your first experience with Linux. That is a bad idea. Okay? I think people are, when they think of Linux, they hear of stories of like, oh, could never get the Wi-Fi card working, could never get this thing working and that thing working. And it's probably true, because I tried Linux a few times over the years and had those experiences. The best way to start with Linux today is to buy hardware that comes with Linux installed on it. So you know when you open it out of the brand new box, it's working. So you remove all that stuff that you don't know about. All the flexibility, all those different distributions, take that out of the equation. There's 2 places, there's many places that are starting to sell. 2 places I would consider looking at, and I looked at when I made my first purchase. I went to System 76, it's a US-based company. They make hardware and they actually have their own distribution now that ships right on the machine. Dell also has a line of computers that come with Linux on them. Great way to start because you get all the trouble out of the way. So you open it up like you would open up a Mac and just expect it to work. It's a great way to get started. I chose to do exactly like I had done 15 years earlier and get a computer that looks like that. It's the same profile as like a Mac Mini or an Intel NUC, if you're familiar with that. It's the same kind of hardware platform. You buy a little box about this big and you supply the monitor and the keyboard and the mouse. I did exactly what I did 15 years earlier. I put it on the side, played with it a little bit each day until I got familiar with it. So why System 76? I'm going to plug them a little bit. One is the hardware is made here. They do get parts from other places in the world, but the computers are created here, and they have outstanding customer support like you expect to get from, and probably better than you get from other companies that you can buy computers from. I bought my first one probably 1.5 years ago, that little device, had some issues, pick up the phone, call them, they answer, they'll stay on the phone with you and help you with problems. This laptop here that I'm running right now, I bought about 7 months ago, maybe 8 months ago, and it crashed for the first time. The hard drive just died about 2 weeks ago. I called them up on the phone, they helped me out. I was back up and running in a couple of hours. It was pretty easy. I had backups. I mean, you still have to back up your computer. So I had backups and it went fine. The interesting thing was the tech support guy I worked with emailed me like 2 days later and made sure everything was okay. Hey, you all set? You have any problems? No. I replied back, no, not having any trouble. About another week later, he followed up again and said, hey, by the way, there's another release of software coming out in the next few days. Want to make sure you are all set and you don't have any issues. So it was really good experience. The other reason to buy a new computer, it's something you want to use. If you pull something out of your closet that's been sitting there for 10 years, who wants to use it? No one wants to use it. Buy a new one, it's something you want to actually spend some time with. And you need to spend time on this next task. I call it breaking the chains. Well, the biggest problem with moving to Linux is your software. It's not the hardware, it's not the operating system, it's the software you're using. So what you need to do when you switch to Linux is you're going to need to find software that will work for all the things that you do in your daily life. Can they run on Linux, and how are you going to run them on Linux? So my criteria for this evaluation, which I did probably over a 3-month period while that Linux machine was sitting on the side as I was using it, is when I looked for software solutions, I wanted to pick one for anything that I would do that would run on Linux and on a Mac. I wasn't convinced I was moving to Linux permanently. I might be on a Mac forever, but I still wanted flexibility. Windows hasn't been an option for me for 15 years. I didn't fall back in love with him with that, so I didn't care about that. And also, as you look at software solutions today, you need to think about how they work with your devices. So I wanted to make sure that any software that I was going to use that had like a mobile aspect to it could run on iOS and Android. And that always something has some sort of, if it's a cloud-based thing, it needs to have a web browser. So that's kind of the criteria I used as I started to research and discover products. So let's deal with some of the categories of software and how I picked them and the choices I made. For Drupal dev, it was a piece of cake. You're done in a half hour if you're a Drupal developer. And those are the software pieces that you want, because Docker, Lando ddev, have a Linux version, you just install it and go. Drupal VM, a little bit more finicky, as it is on every other platform, but there's versions there, you're just up and running. IDEs, I use both PHP Storm and VS Code, kind of have switched recently to VS Code. Both have Linux solutions, just install and go, your licenses work, PHP Storm, they just work, you're fine. So for the core things you need for day-to-day development, I'm on a Drupal side, it's a no-brainer. It's super simple, and guess what? It's running a heck of a lot faster than it was running on your Mac. The Docker stuff is night and day, okay? Even on a less performant machine. As I queried people about tools they use, a lot of people use SQL Pro or a tool like that, so a graphical user interface to get to the database. I'm a little bit more old school, and I kind of just go into the SQL command line to do stuff. So how would I find a solution for that? So guess where you go? You go to Google. You go into Google search and you type SQL Pro on Linux, and you'll get tons of results back. There's one website that always comes back at the top of the list. It's called alternative2.net, and you basically, it's a website that says, I'm looking for this kind of product, I'm switching from this operating system to this one, and it gives you a bunch of recommendations. It's a great tool to use when you're doing this kind of research. So, by the way, there is a solution on Linux there that seems to be very highly rated. Never tried it. I recommend the command line. Microsoft Office, another questionable area, like how do you solve that problem? Well, there's an open source solution called LibreOffice. I looked at that right away when I started to do this switch. I installed it. Within a month, I got rid of my Office 365 subscription and haven't paid for it for a year and a half. It reads and writes to Microsoft in all standard formats, and for the work that I do, in Word and spreadsheets and stuff, it works absolutely fine, and actually I prefer it. It's a little slower, I think a little more memory hog, but it works fine, and it's a simplified version of some of the crazy stuff that's in Word today. So highly recommend that. It's an easy solution. Was everything so simple? No, the wheels did fall off a little bit. And this was the problem. Adobe, okay? Adobe products are industry standard tools for a professional. I have a subscription to Adobe suite of products. I canceled it 2 months ago after I got the confidence to do it. I primarily used Photoshop, a little bit of Illustrator, and Audition. This is a problem. Because if you're a design, now I couldn't do this presentation at Design for Drupal in Boston because the room's full of designers. They're not going to switch to Linux. If Adobe is a key part of your day-to-day work, this conversation probably doesn't make sense. Just being honest with you. I do know some designers who are just so pro free software that what they do is they run Adobe anyway. And their strategy is something like this, is they run, if you have no Linux options and it's a Windows product, you have 3 choices. One is you can run Windows in a virtual machine and it runs fine. I have Windows running in a virtual machine for doing testing and stuff, works fine. Just not my choice. The second one is a product called Wine. Wine is an application that runs in Linux. It's not an emulator, but it's a layer that translates between Windows and Linux, and you can run lots of stuff in there. If you go to, there's a website, I think I'm going to show you in a few slides down. You can install lots of products that run in Windows. A lot of gamers use this to run Windows games, so that's an option for you. The last one is find alternative software. If you're on a Mac and it's Mac-only software, you have no other choices. You have to find an alternative. You can't run, well, you can with a lot of pain, I tried it, to run Linux in a virtual machine, but it's just not set up to do that. So if you have software that you love on your Mac, you have to find an alternative. The good news is, I've been using Mac for all those years. I found alternatives for everything. And some of the software is actually far better than what I was using on the Mac. And there's far more options too. In the open source world, there are way more options for you, and they're harder because you gotta go through them to find the one that you want, but there's really a lot more choices for you. So my alternatives for Adobe Photoshop was to use GIMP. It's an open source, runs on all the platforms. It's nowhere near like Photoshop. It's okay for the work that I'm doing, which is small edits to images and things like that. Doesn't have not non-destructive functions in it, and so it's not close, but it's good enough for what I'm currently doing. And when I got rid of Audition, I used Audacity, which is actually a great replacement for audio editing. So this is the Wine HQ. I did a search on it to see if there was anything for like Illustrator. It comes back and says that Illustrator 10 works great, and the rating is great under Wine. So there are options for you. Some other apps, note-taking. I use something called Standard Notes. Screenshots, Flameshot is a tool I use. Video editing, I was using ScreenFlow, which is a really great product on Mac. I haven't found anything that good on Linux. So some of the other Apple things, I still use Apple devices, so I haven't eliminated it from my life. So I can do little movie edits on my iPad. I'm not using really a Mac for any of that stuff anymore. Apple brought the iPad in to like replace a laptop, and that's kind of what it's done for me. I still have an iPad and I do my Mac-y things on it. I don't use the Mac for that kind of stuff anymore. iMessage is an issue. If you're in the iMessage world, you like to get your messages on your laptop, that's not going to happen. It's a closed system. What I did, I switched my family over to using something called Telegram. We don't use, for group messages, we don't use iMessage any longer. That wasn't my fault either. My oldest daughter switched to Android about 6 months ago, which forced the rest of the family to not do group messaging inside of the iPhone because it doesn't work well on Android. So during the transition, lots of things I learned. I got comfortable, I already said building, working in a Linux environment. I did get that sense of freedom. I pay more attention to software freedom now than I used to. I have this realization now that the operating system is just another app and it's plug and play. And as a result of that, I've started to do that distro hopping, switching distros here and there. I did this experiment about 3 months ago. I said, can I put together a laptop for $300 that a Drupal developer could use running Linux so that you don't have to spend $1,800, $2,000 on a Mac laptop? So I did some research, got into some of the chat groups that I'm involved with and on this Linux stuff, and said, hey, if I go to Best Buy and buy a $300 laptop, is that a good choice for doing something in Linux? And the answer was no. That's junk. The $300 laptop in a Best Buy is junk. You're better off spending that money or a little less, go out to eBay and buy something that's business class machine and maybe 5, 6, 7 years old. So that's what I did. I went and bought it, did some research. ThinkPad 420 is a big thing out there. There's like a whole cult around it. It's like the last ThinkPad from 2011 that had the clickety-click keyboard, and it has all the ports on the sides and stuff. And I found one on eBay without a power cord and without a hard drive for $45. So I went and bought those things, and for like $91, it's not a wimpy machine either. It's an i5 second gen 3.2 gigahertz machine. Came with 8 gigs of memory. I installed all those Drupal-y things on it, and it runs like a charm. It's from 2011. I wondered if that was a fluke. Could I do it again? Well, I've done it like 6 times already. So now I got this like eBay thing coming up all the time with these notifications telling me, hey, there's a computer here for $11. So I found another one that I actually brought here today. So if anyone's interested in getting started, I'm gonna let someone have this if they want it. This is a T420. This one cost $75 and it needed a battery. So the total investment for me was $151 to get what I think is actually just as good a machine as that 2015 MacBook Pro. It runs just as good in Linux doing the things that I do. So if anyone is interested in this laptop, raising your hand, we could talk after. So in summary, and I appreciate your patience and thank you for coming today. Linux is just not for geeks anymore. I was shocked when I got down this path to realize how good these operating systems were, especially from the graphical user interface. They're as good as the Mac, if not better. I prefer Pop! OS. I've tried a bunch now. It fits good into the development environment. It's very minimal. It doesn't look like cheesy like you think of like the Linux operating system looking. It's great. These GUIs do compete with the Windows and Mac stuff that's out there. You know, you can take control of your computing world. You don't have to let the 2 big companies that are out there in the operating systems make the decisions for you about hardware and software that you want to use. An important part for me was growing your skills. So if DevOps is important for you, this is a good way to get yourself educated. And the last tip is, if you're going to go down this road and you're serious about it, buy the new hardware. And last tip, fall in love again, switch to Linux. So these slides, I have some resources of some of the YouTube videos and podcasters that I listened to early on, a link to System 76. And does anyone have any questions?
I use my SQL Workbench every day. Works great. You mentioned it in one of your slides.
That's the Linux one?
Little dolphin one.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That you said you hadn't tried it.
I haven't tried it yet. Yeah, I stay out of the graphical, but that's great to know.
I use Inkscape instead of Illustrator.
Yeah.
Okay, I've tried that. Does that work good?
Very easy to learn.
Yep.
It's got, I mean, I haven't used Illustrator as much, so I can't say it has everything, but it works really well.
Okay.
And then I would Google, what OS do Google developers use? And you'd like the answer.
Oh, really? Okay, that's interesting.
So you can, so Lenovo's good. Look on the Ubuntu or distro, you can see what supported laptops are certified. That's another way to look for them. Lenovo, most of the new models have really good Linux support. This is a Ubuntu 18 on a T580. The other thing is if you have OS X and you want to run apps, you actually can run OS X in a virtual machine. If you search for Linux text tips, he just showed how you can do PCI Express pass-through for graphics cards. So if you have a workstation at home you can actually have a full-on 100% OS X running in the VM on a Linux machine.
Interesting. So I tried that about 8 months ago, and it could have been because my level of knowledge of Linux is getting better and better by the week. It could be that I had a lot of trouble. I got it like up and running at one point, but it kind of failed.
Yeah, I actually have OS X emulated on here, but it's bad because it doesn't have the PCI Express on the graphics card. But
Interesting.
you can definitely do that, and you can also do the same thing with Windows. I do 100% game in Windows emulated on a workstation class Linux box. So.
Excellent. Thank
You need a
you.
license
Yes.
for OS X?
For OS X, technically you're supposed to own a Mac to run it. So, and if you Google up Linux tips about OS X emulated, he will give you the legal disclaimers. So you are supposed to have a Mac. I have an old Mac still, so your mileage may vary illegal on that. But it does work, and it works pretty good.
Great tip.
How about security, viruses? I know like Mac's whole thing is like we're harder to get viruses than PCs. Is Linux further beyond that, or do they have their own issues too?
Yeah, great question. I would say that Linux is probably the safer of all of them, but Mac is probably very close. I have seen the advice that I've received when I went down this journey is don't even install any virus because you don't need it.
Antivirus.
Yeah. So I haven't. I never really, since moving to Mac, that has sort of been out of my mind space for quite a while, actually.
Doesn't say, well, he might have made it to a point, but I mean, if you didn't want to do total commitment or have two computers, you can just partition your hard drive.
Yeah.
Run both.
Yeah, so that's an option. So you could dual boot a machine, boot it into Linux, or boot it into Mac or Windows. To me, I wanted to like make a decision and just kind of stick and not keep the crutch of going back to the Mac. So that was sort of my goal. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to say we wanted to try out Linux, no commitment, can just get like a bootable live USB version of it, and just run there on your machine, and just boot off of the USB.
Great. Yeah, great point. So a way to try out a Linux distribution, they have ISOs that you can just download on a USB drive. I've done this many times. Just plug it into USB port, boot up your machine, and have it boot from that USB drive, and you're running that Linux distribution. You're not getting the full flavor of it because the performance isn't quite as good. You're not saving stuff to the disk, but it does gives you an easy way to try something out. Great tip.
If you do Pop OS on a USB stick, it has the whole kernel in there and
Yeah.
everything? Okay.
Absolutely.
It's a full ISO. So
Yeah.
you don't have to do the
You
kernel.
download it. You gotta have some special software to download the ISO properly, so it's a bootable USB. If you look up Etcher, is probably the easiest way to do that. Drop it in, and you're up and running.
I'm not much of a developer, so I use Linux several times, mostly to manage the servers there for our website. But most of my job is front end, so I do HTML, style sheets, stuff like that. And I'm a heavy user of Dreamweaver. And,
Okay.
did you find any good alternative to that? Did you have any experience?
Yeah. So it's just HTML. There's lots of editors.
Yeah, I tried several times to switch to Linux because I kind of get disgusted by the direction that Mac is going, because I'm an even older adopter of Macintosh. I think it was 98 that I started using it, and and I fell in love with the machine. But now they're going the same direction that Windows was going years ago.
Yeah.
I don't understand. They screwed them by going in this direction. Now they're switching, going back to what Windows is doing.
I think what you'll find if you're looking for softwares like to replace Dreamweaver, you'll have many more options than you have in Linux, or that you have in Mac and in Windows. Many more options.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
So it should be I would imagine it's a very
I tried
straightforward
a couple
transition.
of times, but again, there were too many. I made the mistake you said, using an old laptop to run.
Bad idea.
And
As I'm recommending someone grab a 2011.
but I didn't have enough skills, I guess, to fix the issues that I was getting
Right.
with sound cards and stuff.
Yeah, so that's a good point, is he says that, you know, he didn't have the skills, you tried to hold. And that's how I was when I started. I didn't have the skills to figure these problems out. Now, like when I loaded a Linux onto the old MacBook, there are issues with the wireless card and stuff, but I'm knowledgeable enough to fix them pretty quickly. I have the confidence and the knowledge to deal with what the problem is.
Yeah, unfortunately, you know, I have work to do. I don't have time to
Yeah,
work.
that's true. That's true.
That's the big problem, is like, I've been using Photoshop since I was 12 years old, and I have to learn a whole new software.
That's a
But
pain.
I still have to be efficient at work.
Right, yeah. Yeah, you can do like I do, wait till your kids move out of your house and then you have all the time in the world.
17 years.
Yeah. Yeah, so the biggest pain I had with getting away from Photoshop, because I knew it inside and out, was like the flow, you know, what is the process to do things. It's not even just the clicks, but there's just a mental shift of how the software works. So that is painful, but I think the benefits of getting there are worth it.
Did you switch all the family to the Linux?
Oh, that's a good question. I thought someone was gonna ask that. The whole family has not switched to Linux. The funny thing is the daughter that I mentioned who switched to Android 6 months ago, she also switched to a Windows computer. She's buying her own stuff now, so I didn't have much say in that. And the rest of the family is still using Macs. So
They haven't heard the speech.
Yeah, really, yeah.
You have to record it then.
right. So I think at some point I may switch them, but I'm not sure. Apple still has a place for people who want Apple products and don't want a lot of headache and don't want to fix a lot of things. It has a place. So, and that place might be with my first wife, so she might stay with that.
I think they asked Linus Torvalds the same thing, and they
Yeah.
also use a mix of Macs and.
Yeah. Use the best product for the best job, and I think today the Linux desktop is definitely the best place for someone in my position.
What are some of the accessibility options, like screen readers and magnifiers and speech to text and other assistive technology that you might have to plug in?
Yeah, good question. It's like how accessible is Linux? I don't know the answer to that. I know there are screen readers. I'm not aware of if they are ahead, behind, or with the other operating systems. I don't know the answer to that. All right, well, thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of the conference.